If we go down in time to the history of the Egyptians, Thutmose III, he's the one who said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" He was the Napoleon of Egypt. He was the great lawmaker. Nobody stood in his way, or he would destroy them. And he made an anti-Sabbath law, as you will remember, when he said, "You will not rest, you will not Shabbat, you will not keep the Sabbath, you will not rest, but you will get unto your burdens." And when he made laws which countered God's law, his authority was judged at an end by God. So who permitted him to rule until he overstepped the mark? God. God permitted him to rule. Did God permit the king of Egypt to even be the authority in terms of government procedures over his own children? Yes or no? Yes. Were they subject to the rules of Egypt? Yes. Did he have the power to even enslave them? Yes or no? Yes. Did he have the power to oppress them? The Bible says they were sorely oppressed. But there was a limit. 70 times 7. When your probation closes, you will be eradicated. So let's go away from Egypt and let's go to the Assyrians. This is history, grisly Assyrian record of torture and death. Assyrian national history, as it has been preserved for us in the inscriptions and pictures, consists almost solely of military campaigns and battles. When you look at the news today, do you see military campaigns and battles, yes or no? So it seems as if this line of power that rules over the children of disobedience has military might and military power and exercises that power even over the children of God. Is that right? Assyria emerged as a territorial state in the 14th century BC. Its territory covered approximately the northern part of modern Iraq. The first capital of Assyria was Assur, located about 150 miles north of the modern Baghdad. And there on the left is a relief of Assyrian torture. They would rip the skins of people off their bodies while they were alive. The Bible tells us that they took Manasseh with hooks through his nose and dragged him to Babylon. He must have had one painful nose. On the west coast of the Tigris River, the city was named for its national god Assur, from which the name Assyria is also derived. From the outside, Assyria projected itself as a strong military power bent on conquest. Countries and people that opposed Assyrian rule were punished by the destruction of their cities and the devastation of their fields and orchards. In the 9th century, Assyria had consolidated hegemony over the northern Mesopotamia. It was then that the Assyrian armies marched beyond their own borders to expand their empire, seeking booty to finance their plans for still more conquest and power. By the mid-19th century, the Assyrian menace posed a direct threat to the small Syro-Palestine states to the west, including Israel and Judah. So do they eventually try to take over God's people as well? Yes. And they have the line of authority because they are children of disobedience. And these are reliefs where we find the Assyrian armies. Here are the heads of the decapitated people that they decapitated. Here the people are strung up on poles with spears all the way through them. The cruelest tortures that you can imagine. And people were scared of these rulers. If Cain shall be avenged 7 times, Lamech 70 times 7 times, if you don't fall subject to us, we'll show you what power we have. And we have authority. We have it directly by permission of God. Let's go to Roman law. By this time, the governments of the world have consolidated a legal system which is second to none. There's a law for every single transgression you can think of. There are penalties for moral deeds which are just indescribable, and permissions for immorality which are equally indescribable. Does it ring a bell? And how did they deal with dissenters in the Roman Empire? Well, you were thrown to the lions in the Colosseum. You were crucified on a cross. You were eaten alive by animals. You were whipped with whips until your entrails hung out. The cruelty was just indescribable. And their aggression, did their aggression turn against God's people? Yes or no? Yes, it did. But they ruled, and they had power to rule. Now let's have a look at one man who lived at that time, and his name was Herod the Great. He has been described as a madman who murdered his own family and a great many rabbis. If he murdered a great many rabbis, then did he have power to do so even over God's people? Yes or no? Must have had. The evil genius of the Judean nation prepared to commit any crime in order to gratify his unbounded ambition. Any crime. And the greatest builder in Jewish history is known for his colossal building projects. Does this ring a bell, Enoch? Does this ring a bell, Nimrod? The great builders? So they loved their cities. They loved their great monumental buildings. He is known for colossal building projects throughout Judea, including his expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Now, excuse me, this man is a cruel ruler who has power to rule. God's people are even subject to him. And he's building a temple for the worship of Yahweh. The construction of the port at and Masada and Herodium and all of these, and he was a powerful man. The Herodian dynasty was a Judean dynasty of Edomian descent. Herodian dynasty began with Herod the Great, who assumed the throne of Judea. So he ruled over God's people with Roman support and bringing down the century-long Hasmonean kingdom. His kingdom lasted until his death in 4 BCE, when it was divided between his sons as tetrarchy, which lasted about 10 years. Most of those kingdoms, including Judea, were incorporated into the provinces, etc., etc. These Judaized Edomites were not considered Jewish by the dominant Pharisaic tradition. So even though Herod may have considered himself of the Jewish faith, he was not considered Jewish by the observant and national Jews of Judea. Could we say today that there are some people who consider themselves of the Christian faith, but those who believe in the law of God and the Torah do not really consider them of the same level of knowledge in terms of Christianity? Yes or no? Is that possible? Now, Herod was a loyal supporter of Hyrcanus II. Antipater appointed Herod governor of Galilee at 25 and his elder brother governor of Jerusalem, and he enjoyed the backing of Rome. But his brutality was condemned by the Sanhedrin. He was brutal. He was a ruthless man. 2 years later, Antigonus, nephew, took the throne from his uncle with the help of the Parthians, and Herod fled to Rome, and there he did some pleading with his Roman rulers to restore him to power, and there he was elected by the Roman Senate King of the Jews. Now here was the King of the Jews. And Josephus and the encyclopedias are the sources. And Romans 9:13 says, as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I have hated. Now, does God hate people? Of course not. So what did God hate? He hated the mindset of Enoch. He hated the mindset of Enoch. And here was a man who claimed to be ruler over God's people, but he had the mindset of Enoch. And God hates that mindset. Did God permit him to rule? Yes. He permitted him to rule. His first leadership role was as governor of Galilee, a position granted to him by his father, Antipater. Early on, Herod demonstrated his brutality by ruthlessly crushing a revolt in Galilee. Later, during the Parthian incursion, he flees, makes his way to Rome, where he impresses Mark Antony, and with his help, persuades the Roman senators to name him King of the Jews, so he can return and bring Judea back under Roman control. And after 3 years of fighting, he takes the throne, and he is officially King of the Jews. Can you see why he's upset when suddenly there's a rumor there's another King of the Jews? Matthew 2 verse 18, in Ramah there was a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and would not be comforted, for they are not. So he murders the little children in order to get rid of Christ, but he underestimates God. Does he persecute God's people? Yes. Does he hate this kind of opposition, godly opposition? Absolutely. Whose mindset does he have? He has the mindset of Cain. He has the mindset of Cain. He has the same power to rule. Who does he get his power from? Who lends him that power, gives him his title? Rome. Rome gave him his power, gave him his title. You're the King of the Jews. And so he built a temple. I'm the King of the Jews. I'll build a temple. And he builds a temple. But Herod saw fit, however, to place at the main entrance a huge Roman eagle. Who does he dedicate the temple to? Not to the God of the universe. He dedicates the temple, which stands for worship. He dedicates it to Rome. This is history. And the pious Jews saw this as sacrilege, as well they should. Here it was in symbols. Take it in antitype. Can we see God's worship dedicated to Rome today, yes or no? Wouldn't the pious Christians see that as sacrilege, yes or no? Okay. 2 teachers and a group of Torah students smashed this emblem of idolatry and oppression, but Herod had them hunted down and dragged in chains to his residence in Jericho, where they were burned alive. Do you see his mindset? Do you know of Christians that were later burned alive because they had a different mindset to Rome? Thus, having built the temple, Herod took pains to make sure it would be run without future problems of this kind. You will worship your God according to my dictates. He appointed his own high priest, having by then put to death 46 leading members of the Sanhedrin, the rabbinical court. So by the time Jesus actually starts preaching, the good guys are all dead already. They've been put to sleep. Herod's cruelty was legendary. I'm talking about the Herodian mind. But it's not isolated to Herod. It is a historic mindset that comes all the way from the Garden of Eden and runs with an unbroken chain all the way through history and to our present day. And we have to find the current custodians of this Herodian mindset. Now, I chose Herod. I could have said the mind of Cain. But I find in Herod the culmination of history, because it is Herod, or his son, who was also a Herod, who even crucified the Prince of Peace. So this mindset, this enmity towards God's people, coupled with the power to exercise it under official authority, is mind-boggling. Because initially God granted Cain the mark of Cain, the authority to rule. And he established an enormous secret police force. I want you to look at history and let the bells start ringing. Brutally killed anyone suspected of plotting against him, and created Roman peace by slaughtering all dissidents. We will have military intervention if you don't do as we say. Herod Antipas, the mindset continues. Remember the story of Herod, Herodias and Salome? I don't want to go into that typology, I've done it before. But the head of John the Baptist, give it to me. Now fortunately in our typology, this was a type of the Elijah, but there was also an Elijah that was translated without seeing death. So we will see. Some of us might end up being John the Baptist typologically, and some of us might end up, hopefully, being the other one, the one who did not see death. And this is Jesus before Herod Antipas. Can you imagine the king and the prince of the universe being arrayed before this earthly monarch, who is sitting there by whose authority? God's authority. He has been permitted to rule because God in his mercy doesn't want anyone to be lost. Now I want to ask you a question. Did God give Herod Antipas every single possible opportunity to repent? Yes or no? What does that tell you about the character of God? It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. And I want you to cast your mind back in history. The Babylonian Empire, where Nebuchadnezzar set up a system which was just the same as Herod's. Nebuchadnezzar had a secret police second to none. He knew everything that was happening in his kingdom. He was unbelievably cruel. If you crossed him, you ended up in the fiery furnace, alive, throw you in there. I don't care if my soldiers die in the process. He was a cruel man. He set up a counterfeit system of religion. Did God give him every opportunity to repent? Yes or no? Will he be in heaven? Yes. The Assyrians. If you go down in history, you come to Nineveh. Was there a ruler who repented at the preaching of Jonah? One of the cruelest of all rulers. I think his name was Nahari III. And all of a sudden, all history of his cruelty ceases, and there's no more war and total peace in his kingdom. Does God care about these rulers? Yes. And here he is arrayed before him. He gets a final opportunity. He sees the Prince of Peace. He sees those eyes. He sees them personally. And he has him mocked. And they put a reed in his hand, and they put a crown of thorns on his head, and they beat him over the head over and over and over again and say, prophesy, who beat you over the head. This is the mind of Herod. It is a mind that has separated itself from God, but it has power to rule. And the same day Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. If there's one thing that unites even the warring factions of the children of Cain, it's a common enemy. And if that common enemy is still the Prince of Peace or his followers, so much the better. because Cain slew Abel. And that animosity towards the truth is part and parcel of those who have the mark of Cain, all the way through. Revelation 12:3, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 10 crowns upon his heads, and his tail drew a third part of the stars of heaven, and it cast them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour a child as soon as it was born, Herod the first. And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and a child was caught up unto God and to his throne. Here's the true ruler. His law is a law of justice and mercy. The other ruler also rules with a rod of iron, but he rules with the mark of Cain. And the kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord, against his Christ. Acts 4:26. For of the truth against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, were gathered together. That's scary. That's scary. My question is the following. Can this mark of Cain even progress to within God's people itself? Men and children, brethren, children of the stock of Abraham, and whosoever among you feareth God, to you is the word of this salvation sent. For they that dwell at Jerusalem and their rulers, because they knew him not, nor yet the voices of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath day, they have fulfilled them in condemning him. So what is the criterion of these rulers? They knew him not. And they didn't know the prophecies either. They didn't know him. And they didn't know the prophecies. Should God's people know him and the prophecies? Yes or no? Okay. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. He wasn't satisfied with killing the Prince of Peace and handing him over, beaten, to Pilate. No, he stretched his hand out towards the church, because the mindset of Cain is slay Abel. And when Peter was come to himself, he said, now I know for a surety that the Lord has sent his angel, because he imprisoned even Peter. I jumped a few verses there. And delivered me out of the hand of Herod, and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews. Will there be persecution? Yes or no? Yes. Who is our only deliverer and our only hope in that persecution? Jesus. And I want you to remember that, because we're going to go into very fine detail here. And we prayed that the eyes of this church and of the world will be open